Before we get into today's show, which is not about Bill Gates, Kusha, I want to ask you about Bill Gates.
Wonderful. I was hoping you'd ask.
Yeah. So he wrote this lengthy memo recently and stirred up a lot of discussion in the climate community. Did you read this memo?
I did, Ariana, and it is lengthy and it is provocative. Gates put out this memo, and it's right before COP30, which is the UN climate conference that happens every year, and it's getting underway right now in Brazil. And I think he wrote it to kind of stir up, to borrow your phrase, world leaders to rethink the way that they're spending money. So for listeners who haven't read it, maybe Ariana, could you just kick us off with a little overview of what's in the memo?
Sure. So Gates makes three main points. First, climate change is serious, but we've made great progress. We need to keep backing breakthroughs that will help the world reach zero emissions. Two, we can't cut funding for health and development, programs that help people be resilient, to cut emissions.
Mm-hmm.
And three, that we basically have to put human welfare at the center of our climate strategies. There's one quote I think really gives a frame to the whole memo. And
Is it the doomsday quote?
Yes, it's basically this. The doomsday outlook is causing much of the climate community to focus too much on near-term emission goals, and it's diverting resources from the most effective things we should be doing to improve life in a warming world. And, when he's saying the most effective things, a lot of the things he's talking about are things that the Gates Foundation funds, like eradicating poverty, addressing disease in poor countries, and so on.
Exactly. And I'm so happy you brought up that quote, because that phrase, like focusing too much, I read that and I was like, oh my God, I can hear the blog posts being click-clacked already on the keyboard, right? Let me give you an example. I read in the New York Times that Princeton professor Michael Oppenheimer said that Gates was setting up a false dichotomy usually propagated by climate skeptics that pits efforts to tackle climate change against foreign aid for the poor. And Oppenheimer also warned that Gates's words are bound to be misused by those who would like nothing more than to destroy efforts to deal with climate change. And so for me, when I was reading this, I thought, what is the intent behind this and what is the risk? Because the intent, I believe, is to force folks who care about the climate to think holistically about the metrics we use to measure progress. But what is the opportunity cost of putting out a memo like this? Right now, you and I are debating about how climate skeptics are going to co-opt it.
Yeah, and really well said on the opportunity cost, because it is important. I do agree with the idea that we shouldn't just throw money blindly at anything labeled climate. I think we should be skeptical and deliberate and focused in what we put our money towards when it comes to addressing climate. I also share the concern that some of this language is going to be taken as more fodder for those who don't want to make climate progress, or who think we're exaggerating the problem. And this also reminds me of a conversation we had really recently on the show, which is about the idea of adaptation, right? Whether we should be focusing our efforts there as opposed to mitigation, strictly reducing emissions and warming. And my perspective is the same on both. It is both and. It can and should be. We need them both now and in the future.
I feel you. If you asked me, there is on the margins choices that need to be made because money is finite. And I know it's ironic that Bill Gates is one of the richest people in the world, and now he is saying money is finite. There is a point at which we need to think about how we are going to save lives now. And a part of the article that just gave me pause is this idea that he's really talking about programs that the Gates Foundation focuses on. And I mean, just last March, Gates came out and said, hey, Trump, if you're going to keep making cuts to international aid, the Gates Foundation and the work that we do won't be able to cover that gap. And so now it's no surprise that Gates is coming up and saying, hey, folks, international leaders, we need to focus on the things that the Gates Foundation does.
We need more money.
Exactly.
Sort of.
Thank you. Yeah, we need more money. Every expert that I've talked to has said climate crisis or existential crisis. So the problem is the climate crisis is a threat multiplier. So Gates wants to deal with poverty and disease and starvation. That's great. But at the same time, you can't ignore that if you don't rein in emissions now, then that poverty, that disease, that starvation, all of which are going to be exacerbated by climate change, will get worse.
Yes. And current suffering won't go away if we don't address it. It will get worse. And so I do hear the argument for spending money now to address these things, especially if it can make people and communities who are already facing climate threats more resilient in the future. However, I also find his take pretty techno-optimistic.
I feel like I knew you were going to say it was going to be techno-optimistic. I got to be...
I mean, not surprising. It's Bill Gates, right?
Yeah.
He references a lot of technologies that, some are active or in use today, but a lot of which are not scaling now. And the timeline he gives for when these things are possible is fairly vague. He has this paragraph saying something to the effect that all countries will be able to construct buildings with low carbon cement and steel. I mean, those things are not happening now. Green steel is still pretty expensive and not widely used. He also talks about what I consider to be even farther flung technologies like geological hydrogen and carbon capture. We've talked about on the show how these aren't really going to save humanity's bacon.
There was one point he made that I did feel was my version of techno-optimist, which is that farmers today in poor areas will have access to data that is even better than what the richest farmers today have access to in the near future. Frankly, I could see that happening with the advances in AI. At the same time, you can't ignore that the Gates Foundation, its largest holding, is in Microsoft, and Microsoft and OpenAI are together in business dealings. And I wanted to ask you, Ariana, did that give you pause in any way?
Yeah, I mean, I'm suspicious of AI and its energy demands. I also recognize that there are a lot of applications for AI in the climate crisis that could do a lot to offset some of those concerns around energy use, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, the case that you cited of smallholder farmers getting to have excellent forecasting and farming data at their fingertips from their cell phone, that's great. That's a good use to my mind. That's going to help people save their crops and feed their families. There are other more nefarious uses of AI, and the energy concerns are enormous. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, I feel you. I'm the same way. It's like nothing is cut and dry. And, it reminds me of the fact that he's asking us to question our presuppositions about how we're spending money and if there are climate initiatives that aren't working. And are there climate initiatives that aren't working? Probably. And it's important not to have one metric, which is 1.5 degrees Celsius is bad. And we have to do anything we can to stop that. We should do anything we can to stop that, but it's not the only thing to worry about because there are people that are living right now that we also need to hold in our hearts. But one more piece that I feel like was important to talk about was the green premium.
Yeah, and this is a great place to wrap up our thoughts on the Gates memo. The green premium, for those who don't know, is essentially the cost differential between conventional technologies, often fossil fuel driven, and green or renewable ones. So an example would be green steel, right? Costs a lot more. It is difficult right now to make steel without carbon emissions, but it is possible.
Yeah. And on the other hand, you could take an example like solar power, which, for instance, generally has a zero green premium because it's more affordable to use solar power now than fossil fuels. And so another thing that Gates is asking for, especially on the eve of COP, is that instead of just going on the stand as the leader of a country and saying, hey, here's how we're doing on emissions, Gates is saying that we should also be talking about the different sectors that are contributing the most to warming and climate change, like agriculture, energy production, and to frame the conversation in the way of how those countries are doing at making that green premium going to zero and how different countries can collaborate together specifically to make it to go to zero. And I thought that was really valuable.
And we would really like to know what you, our listeners, think of this memo if you've read it. Send us an email at ariana@climateone.org or kusha@climateone.org, and maybe we'll share those thoughts in a future episode. So for now, let's get on with the show. I'm Ariana Brocious.
I'm Kusha Navidar.
And this is Climate One.
This week, we're talking about War and Peace. Now, not the Tolstoy novel. I would love my books to be less than 1,400 pages long, but the topic of War and Peace, which is at least as hefty.
Yeah. The relationship between climate disruption and conflict is well established and also complicated. There are literally 1,000 studies looking at these connections, and in one, just as an example, researchers argue that a 1 degree Celsius rise in temperature results in a 4.5% rise in civil wars.
That statistic is so unnerving, and that connection might not be immediately apparent to everybody. So for a second, let's play devil's advocate. So, Ariana, you live in Arizona. It's hot. It's getting hotter. Are there any civil wars going on?
Well, no. But people absolutely fight over increasingly scarce water. Those fights are mostly civil for now and take place in conference halls or courtrooms, not out in the streets.
Okay, so then why would climate change fuel conflict in some places but not in others?
Well, that's what we're going to be looking at in today's episode. The example many experts bring up of environmental stress contributing to war is Syria. A severe drought from 2006 to 2011 devastated crops there. That led to mass migration, hundreds of thousands of people moving from farms to cities where there weren't enough jobs and resources for everyone. That exacerbated pre-existing social and economic tensions, which then turned into a full-blown civil war.
But as you may know, Syria is right next door to Jordan, which has been relatively stable. And that is a very interesting juxtaposition.
Yeah, that's true. Then there's also the Sahel, a region in North Africa that's seen rising temperatures and a whiplash of droughts and floods.
Yes, I am looking at a map of the Sahel right now.
No, you're not.
I am, but only because our senior producer told me I had to before we started recording.
Okay, and what do you see?
I see a band of countries, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Chad, Sudan, stretching west to east across the African continent just below the Sahara. In the last couple of years, every one of these countries has either had a jihadist coup or a civil war.
Or both.
Or both. And I'd argue that there are counterexamples of countries that are climate stressed and not at each other's throats. And we'll get into why that is with our first guest.
Then, later in the show, we'll talk with a Palestinian and an Israeli who are working together on environmental peacebuilding in one of the most fraught and fought-over parts of the world.
I am really looking forward to that conversation. What is environmental peacebuilding?
Oh, well, you'll have to listen to find out.
Wow, Ariana, classic podcast move.
Well, let me just say, crises don't always have to bring out the worst in humanity. Sometimes they bring out the best.
Oh, yeah. Like, do you remember the Cajun Navy? Ordinary people going around New Orleans in boats after Hurricane Katrina, rescuing people from rooftops?
Yeah, I mean, that's a wonderful example of people choosing how they respond to a bad situation, a horrible situation, and choosing to help each other, care for one another.
Yeah, that's really well said. So let's get into it. Let's unpack both the dark and the light. Our first guest is Peter Schwartzstein. He's a climate security researcher, an environmental journalist, and author of The Heat and the Fury on the Front Lines of Climate Violence. His reporting is focused on literal and figurative hotspots across the world. He described how he first started to see the link between climate stress and violence in his work.
It was very accidental. I came from a political science sort of academic background, and I made a start in journalism as a political correspondent in Egypt, and quite quickly felt that you could sort of tell the story of a country like Egypt, and perhaps the story of sort of most countries for that matter, better by looking at them through the prism of many of the environmental and climate struggles that they were experiencing than you could through a relatively superficial reading of their politics. But precisely because I had come from that sort of politics or political science background, I was forever looking to kind of marry up my new environment and climate beat with everything that I had previously known and everything that I'd previously worked on, like in the kind of more overtly political and security and conflict domain. And especially in the Middle East, I found that the closer I looked, the more linkages that there were. I mean, this is a region that, as we know, is acutely vulnerable to environmental and climate stresses. Just on water issues alone, it's a region with about 6% of the world's population and about 1.5% of the world's freshwater resources. And that mismatch is just growing more jarring and more kind of badly out of whack with every passing year.
So was it just by chance that you saw this link, or was it kind of unavoidable if you looked at conflict? Climate was always right next door to that connection.
I think it was thoroughly unavoidable. It was just that kind of there were very few people for mostly good reasons, like looking to kind of explore that relationship. I mean, we know that historically kind of journalistic beats have been relatively siloed, sort of folks who covered conflict, people who looked at environment, climate science, sort of stayed within what they saw as their lane. And it was really quite rare, and again, for some understandable safety-related reasons, to have people who worked on climate and environment issues working in what were some sort of tetchy, complicated, and occasionally dangerous parts of Iraq, Syria, Sudan, and parts of the Sahel.
Peter, that's a great point because for me, before I got into media, and I'm sure for a lot of listeners, you think about conflict reporter or a war reporter. There is a very classic archetype that you think of, and climate is not something that traditionally, the movies that are made about war reporters don't include them talking about environmental like emissions or things like that, but they are very closely linked from your own experience. And let's skip to today. You've argued that the amount of violence that is already connected to climate change is being vastly underestimated. Why do you think that is?
So, I mean, there's several parts to this answer. The first one, which is I argue that we are not adequately taking into account how climate change is acting on other drivers of instability, kind of broadly recognized non-climate drivers of instability, like inequality, like corruption, like poor governance of different stripes. And I'll unpack that with an example. So between about 2014 and 2017, I spent probably at least half of that period in parts of Iraq and Syria that had recently been liberated from ISIS. And I was trying to kind of better understand how the jihadi group had sort of benefited from collapsing agricultural conditions to bolster its ranks. And much to my surprise, after sort of several years of related work, I found that some of the areas that ISIS had enjoyed sort of the greatest sort of unfortunate results in enticing sort of young and middle-aged men into its ranks were the villages on the periphery of the city of Mosul in northern Iraq. And that was a really, really surprising development to me because those villages were by no means the poorest of the poor. Many of them had amenities like air conditioning or like refrigerators that much poorer, much more geographically peripheral communities could only dream of. But what they did have was this sort of proximity to the city, and hence a very strong awareness of the kind of growing gulf between their fortunes and the fortunes of the city people. Their fortunes were almost entirely dependent upon farming, which was deteriorating in line with the kind of increasing inhospitability of the conditions, and the fortunes of the people in the city, which weren't exactly thriving, but which were for the most part much less exposed to various climate stresses. So, I mean, that
because they weren't farming, clearly.
Exactly.
Weren't farming
so we have
city, yeah.
Exactly. So you just have kind of a range of existing inequalities which were aggravated by climate stresses, and that was kind of putty in the hands of these sort of rather brutally effective ISIS recruiters. One example to sort of just illustrate how inequality is tying in with climate change in so many scenarios to kind of very unfortunate ends.
You speak to a lot of people whose livelihoods depend directly on land and water. So you mentioned farmers, but also you talk to fishermen, you talk to sheep herders. What kind of stories have stayed with you that capture how environmental strain can balloon into tension, like social, political tension?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's absolutely no coincidence that in most of the countries in which I've worked over the past decade and a bit, it's the farmers, it's sort of the agrarian communities that are most acutely vulnerable to this. And that's because we know that sort of agriculture, along with associated professions like fishing and herding, is just more vulnerable to climate stresses than almost any other. And I mean, yeah, to give you another story to sort of flesh that out, working in Burkina Faso and other parts of West Africa, I've met quite a lot of young men, like a guy called Boubacar, who lived in a village that was several hours drive sort of out into the sort of quite arid scrub west of the capital. And he was an extremely quiet, sort of calm, sensitive guy, a guy who was sort of really quite temperamentally ill-suited to sort of any form of military service. But kind of as the years went on and as kind of the farming livelihoods on which he and his immediate family had depended sort of deteriorated as the rains worsened, more and more of those in his immediate orbit kind of found themselves either sort of forced or just enticed into the ranks of a bunch of different armed groups, either those loyal to the government or those loyal to some of the sort of jihadi or jihadi-linked groups that are taking over large chunks of the Sahel. And after what I think was the fifth failed harvest in 6, he too felt that he had no choice but to seek a salary with a kind of government-aligned militia with a sort of terrible reputation for brutality. I mean, sure enough, he joined, and I stayed in sort of relatively regular contact with him over the following year or two. And then he went quiet, so to speak, and I made a bunch of inquiries and found that, yeah, he had died in fights with sort of Al-Qaeda linked groups in the general area. And so that story, along with just so many others that I've heard on a few different continents, just illustrates how the increasing unviability of farming and so many other rural lifestyles is pushing people, in many instances, by circumstance, not by will or choice, into the ranks of a bunch of kind of nasty groups, or groups that are not necessarily nasty, but in which they have no particular desire to place themselves.
Wow, it's a powerful story to have experienced firsthand. You're talking about governments, and we're jumping continents now, and it makes me think about how climate pressures exist basically everywhere at this point, and they don't exist in equal measure everywhere, but there are populations of people facing very tough challenges, and tough choices like the one that you just brought up. But the violence isn't happening equally everywhere either. And to bring it back to what you were saying, what role does government play in that? Like, giving folks obviously better options, better protection helps out, but how much of this can be controlled by government intervention to kind of not exacerbate the problem, but mitigate what's going on?
It's almost all about governance. I mean, climate-related violence is almost always the way that I frequently put it, like an ugly marriage of climate stresses and poor quality governance. And if you've got extra poor quality governance, it doesn't necessarily take even particularly severe climate stresses to sort of push a community, an individual, or even a broader part of a country over the edge. We have quite a few instances in which extremely climate-battered parts of the world have largely refrained from or avoided climate-related violence, or at least avoided it on a large scale, even as places that are not quite as hard hit by kind of extreme heat, prolific drought, or kind of a range of other extreme weather events tumble into associated forms of violence. But this goes both ways. I mean, a lot of the time, it's not just a kind of a ruler or a series of rulers performing extremely poorly due to their own incompetence or corruption. There's a really grim cyclical element to all of this, which is that climate change can also reduce a government's capacity to govern well. As we've seen, I mean, even in the US, just to bring it a bit closer to home for a moment, in the aftermath of Hurricane Helene in and around North Carolina last September, FEMA's capacity to get emergency assistance to some of the hardest hit communities was much reduced by the very fact that a lot of the roads and bridges and other bits of infrastructure that they needed in order to get that assistance to people had also been washed away by the torrents, by the floods. So there's a kind of intractable looking component to a lot of this.
Did I hear you correctly when you said that you have encountered examples where a harder hit country with fewer resources was able to respond better because they had better governance?
Absolutely. I mean, so I'm currently based in Greece, but I'm quite close to moving to Jordan, probably a few weeks after this podcast goes out. And it's a country in which I've worked a lot over the years. And with the possible exception of Yemen and the possible exception of a few small Pacific and Caribbean island nations, there's no country in the world that is as battered by environmental and climate stresses as Jordan is. And yet it has, for the most part, I mean, we can quibble about a bunch of things at a local level. For the most part, it has avoided climate-related violence on a large scale, certainly relative to the troubles that have afflicted neighboring parts of Iraq and Syria. And a lot of that can be sort of attributed to the relatively superior quality of governance that the Jordanian authorities have displayed. And that's not to sort of say they've necessarily covered themselves in glory, but they've had enough sense, for the most part, when these farming-dependent villages have protested, which they have on a relatively regular basis, not to shoot them with sort of live ammunition, as so many of their peers over the borders have. I mean, it's a sort of low bar of success, but that, in so many of these instances, is the difference between a anger over water spilling into a wider conflagration, or anger over water remaining relatively low level and relatively self-contained.
I want to dive into that more because I find this appraisal of the government functioning when you can tease out money, when you can tease out the climate impacts, to be pretty fascinating. The example that you just used, what is it about that government that sets them up to respond more effectively?
A number of scholars in my field who've sort of tried to dissect what makes a place more vulnerable to climate-related violence. And there's three things that they've principally hit upon. One is having a large share of the population engaged in agriculture for all the reasons that we've already discussed. I mean, it just means that there's that bit more people who are vulnerable to climate stresses. The second is having a history of recent or ongoing conflict. Why is that relevant? Well, because if you've got a history of recent or ongoing conflict, that means you've got tremendous existing distrust, you've got tremendous existing weaknesses or kind of cleavages across society, which climate stresses can just amplify or augment. And the third one is kind of exclusive political systems, i.e. political systems that are perhaps that bit better at understanding and processing the sources of kind of local anger and processing and understanding it without just sort of crushing it in a brutally repressive manner. The problem with authoritarian states and the problem with countries that are just exhibiting poor levels of governance sort of across the board is that they just don't have either the temperament or the capacity to respond to the kinds of tensions, the kinds of anger, the kinds of fury that so often arise out of climate stresses in a kind of peaceful manner. They respond with blunt violence for the most part. And when you respond with blunt violence, you make it much more likely that you're going to be just launching sort of cycles of violence from which it's hard to extricate yourself.
We'll have more of my conversation with Peter Schwartzstein after the break, plus how some Palestinians and Israelis are building trust through cooperation over shared resources.
Trust is the most valuable asset that you could have working with community.
That's up next when Climate One continues. Let's get back to my conversation with climate security researcher Peter Schwartzstein. He's reported on the connections between climate disruption and violence across the globe. And that raised a question for me about bringing this all back home. Your reporting has spanned Middle East, Northeast, West Africa, South Asia, Eastern Europe. I live in the United States. How worried should I be?
Well, I mean, about climate, other things vary. But on a climate-related violence part, more worried than one might imagine. And that's because, I mean, to take a brief step back for a moment, when I and so many others in my field look at climate's contribution to violence, we mostly look at sort of poorer parts of the planet. And there is a pretty good reason for that. I mean, as discussed, kind of climate-related violence is this nasty mosaic, this nasty marriage of climate stresses and poor governance. And both of those in their kind of worst manifestations are generally found in less affluent pockets of the world. But as our own kind of conditions get that little bit less hospitable, and to put it kindly or euphemistically, as our own qualities of governance in much of the rich world also deteriorate, we too are starting to experience more intense manifestations of climate-related violence. Now, some of this is relatively low level and localized. So based here in Greece, I've done a fair bit of work on the impact of drought on theft of various cash crops like olive oil. So between 2023 and 2024, drought across the Mediterranean, which produces almost all of the world's olive oil, raised prices about 70 to 80%. And as a consequence of that huge surge in prices, you had everybody from kind of opportunistic individuals to kind of really established criminal gangs who were all of a sudden incentivized to steal branches of olives on trees through to kind of big trucks toting €1 million worth of olive oil to kind of distribution sites. And so that was kind of a very low-level illustration of how this can manifest itself. But on a larger, more distant, kind of more future scale, Americans and Europeans, and perhaps plenty of people across East Asia and further afield, potentially have an awful lot to fear. And that's because climate change is contributing to increasing public unhappiness with state services and with state performance. I mean, a lot of citizens in wealthier parts of the world have pretty high expectations of state. They have a high expectation that state will provide quality infrastructure. They have a high expectation that state will provide quality services like kind of solid freshwater provision, solid wastewater disposal. And so when those services or kind of state capacities fail, or fail even a little bit, then kind of popular unhappiness can really bound back in a variety of potentially worrisome forms, like kind of people turning to more hardline, more populist, more extremist political parties because they feel that the mainstream ones are simply not giving them what they expect. And we know that a lot of these kind of hardline or sort of peripheral or extremist parties will kind of rationalize those failures by sort of blaming a pretty familiar cast of scapegoats, as opposed to sort of dealing with the root cause of problems, which in many instances perhaps are not easily solvable. So no, this certainly in the years or certainly the decades to come is something that I fear will hit richer parts of the planet, possibly even more severely than they're hitting poorer.
Yeah. It's been so fascinating talking about this narrative. And yet I kind of want to put you to the test in a little way right before we finish this interview to challenge that narrative too. Like the narrative, climate change means misery. I think that's something we hear about all the time. But it's also maybe opened up new paths for dialogue and cooperation. And I'm not trying to end the interview here just like on a good note to end on a good note. I'm genuinely interested. Have you seen that narrative, that other flip side of the coin?
Absolutely. No, I mean, I'll give you a bit of hope now after quite a few minutes.
Oh, please. Thank you. Yeah, right.
of misery and dispiriting you. I gave you an example previously of where kind of climate and environmental issues were sort of helping to pitch people apart. We've also seen how some of these sort of farmer and herder communities who've been really at one another's throats in very literal terms for much of the past decade are actually coming together in so many instances. There were several occasions while working in parts of Mali and parts of Senegal and parts of Mauritania where I found these NGO-implemented pastoral units that basically brought together representatives of pastoral and farming communities in order to enable them to sort of hash out which parts of land would be turned over to farming and farming alone, and which parts of land would be left for herders to graze their animals. There was a kind of dispute resolution mechanism by which farmers could turn for compensation if cattle strayed into their farms and trampled their crops. And simultaneously, there was a means for kind of herders to seek recourse to justice if farmers cultivated crops in areas that were meant to be transhumance corridors for the herders to sort of move their cattle from place A to place B. But because trust between those communities had previously broken down, it required the kind of intervention of an NGO from another part of their respective countries in order for them to actually come together for the kind of cooperation that they all had kind of sought out, but just couldn't sort of summon up through their kind of collective will.
Yeah, like you said, it is, well, maybe I'm making an inference here, but that the role of that NGO in that case was kind of smoothing out the uncertainty curve of different aspects of those farmers' lives and providing security when necessary, but just also giving people a way to know what to expect.
Communities can get stuck in spirals of violence that very few among them actually want. Because so much of this is wrapped up with governance, most, if not all, climate-related violence remains within our capacity to quash. Not easily quash, but like the die is not cast on any of this. And so when I kind of lay out climate-related security risks, I think or hope that it will be interpreted as a taste of the kinds of violence that we will be kind of experiencing on a much grander scale if we don't get our act together. It should not be perceived as a kind of harbinger of kind of imminent, inevitable doom. Secondly, and this is something that I really find extremely kind of heartening. I mean, in the 12, 13 years in which I've been doing this kind of work across conflict climate settings in about 4 or 5 different countries, I've been quite stunned that there's not a lot more climate-related violence than there actually is. Like, particularly if you think about the sheer deprivation and sort of misery in so many instances of the conditions that people are up against. If you look at just the extraordinarily rapacious or predatory or poor quality governance that people must wrestle with, It's a measure of how much people, or most people, will go to avoid violence, certainly if they're granted the tools and the mechanisms to do so. And third, we have also seen how shared climate and environmental problems can, in certain circumstances and kind of in the right hands, help to bring people together as opposed to just tearing them apart. Like shared challenges shared water, shared farming challenges can be sort of entry points or bridges for communities to come together in the face of that sort of shared challenge. It sounds quite kumbaya-esque, and yet certainly at a kind of community to community or sort of tribal to tribal level in parts of the African continent and further afield, we have seen how this can help to sort of build trust between communities that had sort of long since shattered it, how it can sort of really be that kind of tool or issue around which people mobilize for their collective good.
Peter Schwartzstein is a researcher, a journalist focused on climate security, and author of The Heat and the Fury on the Front Lines of Climate Violence. Peter, thank you so much for your work and for sharing it with us.
It's a pleasure to join.
Nearly 30 years ago, the Arava Institute in Israel began as a program to study environmental science and explore ways to build peace in the Middle East. Today, the Institute brings together Israelis, Palestinians, Moroccans, and Jordanians to study and tackle shared environmental challenges. On the ground, Israeli and Palestinian partners are putting that work into action, installing projects in water management, renewable energy, and sustainable agriculture across one of the most tense and disputed regions in the world. Liana Berlin-Fischler is the Associate Director for the Center for Applied Environmental Diplomacy at the Arava Institute. She's Jewish and grew up in the Washington, D.C. area. She moved to Tel Aviv, Israel, after doing a semester abroad there during her undergraduate studies.
Clive Lipchin, who's one of our lecturers, brought me to the Arava Institute. His course was the first touch point for me for meeting the inequities between Israelis and Palestinians from a water resource perspective. It was extremely important to me, if I'm Jewish and feel connected to this land, to understand it from every perspective, not just the romantic view, not just the connected view, but even see the fragments of it and be able to hold all of it, which is a lot of what this work demands, being able to hold more than one story, more than one perspective. And I felt very, very called to begin tackling these challenges.
Fareed Mahameed grew up in al-Fahim, an Arab Palestinian city inside of Israel. He also works at the Arava Institute as the Assistant Director of the Center for Transboundary Water Management.
I call it like climate justice. In a way, for me, this is like as Palestinian, my tikkun olam.
Tikkun olam, Hebrew for repairing the world.
So in Jewish, tikkun olam literally means like you should fix the world. Like it sounds strange now as a Palestinian to say it, but I really take it from as a universal value. Like this is my tikkun olam, not only for my community, also for the situation. Try to bring, what we can do. Again, I'm not promising peace. Unfortunately, I don't have the power to end the occupation. I'm trying to do my best to help communities to try to make their process, to optimize their agricultural methods, to help them where we can with off-grid, technologies.
Mahameed works mostly in the West Bank. Before I could really understand how his work fits into peacebuilding, I felt like I had to wrap my head around the history and geography of the region. How the land is divided is a little complicated, with borders shifting over decades and continuing to be disputed today. Israel is pretty small. It's about the size and shape of New Jersey. On the western edge, there's Gaza, a narrow strip of land where roughly 2 million Palestinians live. Then there's the West Bank, which is actually on the east side of Israel, but on the west bank of the Jordan River. It's a much larger area, home to around 3 million Palestinians. Israel took control of Gaza, the West Bank, and other parts of the region in 1967. Today, Israel maintains military control over much of the West Bank. Since then, 700,000 Jewish Israelis have settled in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, in settlements considered illegal by most of the international community. So now back to Mahameed's work. He focuses on supporting Israel's Arab Bedouin citizens who are indigenous to the Negev Desert in southern Israel. He also works with Palestinian communities and farmers in the West Bank and Jordan Valley.
So life in the Jordan Valley is very difficult. It's very hot climate. It's also one of the few that actually we call it sometimes like a tropical, because it's very hot and it's also very humid. So the communities there are simple, peasant, like we call them Fallahin communities. They live mostly in off-grid villages. They are like a clan-based, family-based community. Most of them also are only beginning to send their kids to academics because there's no infrastructure and transportation. So socioeconomic status is difficult for them. But I call them they're what's left of the true Palestinians, before the Nakba and the urbanization and occupation. I call them the guardian of the land. They're keeping the Palestinian spirit of agriculture, of community alive.
The Nakba means catastrophe in Arabic and refers to the mass displacement and dispossession of Palestinians during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Most Palestinian cities and towns in the West Bank are not fully connected to the Israeli water grid. And for Palestinians living in the Israeli-occupied West Bank, access to water has been a struggle for years. Since October 7, 2023, violence in the area has ramped up, and water has been even more difficult to access.
This is also what amazed me, especially nowadays. Everybody speak about ceasefire, and Trump speak about he stopped Israel from annexing the West Bank, which he doesn't need. Israel already annexed the West Bank. De facto today, the annexation of the West Bank is on steroids, the ethnic, there's ethnic cleansing. And actually now I've just got a message from a settler who's, saying, look what we did just last month. We burned this village, we attacked this community, just in the open. And this is why the situation now in the West Bank, although it's not as severe as in Gaza, it's very severe in comparison. Smotrich, who's a settler, who's the Minister of Finance, and also Ben Gvir, who's also a settler, who's a Minister of the National Security, are trying before the next election to grab as much land as possible to prevent a Palestinian state. They only can do it if they can evict and erase those communities, because those are the last community who are gluing the fractured Palestinian state together.
It's a challenging environment, both physically and politically. But Mahameed feels compelled to help.
Whatever we can do to help this community, withstand not only the climate change, which is getting hotter and drier and worse, but also, let's say, the political climate, which is now very, very violent and very even life-threatening, is for me a very important job, because if we want to see, hopefully, a change or a peace, and although now it sounds very cliched, I still do believe in peace, because I don't think there's other way than this way. And in order to do it, you need to make your stand. So this is making our stand with the community and bring them climate technology, climate resilience, and also climate justice and climate resistance to to resist whatever happening there.
The infrastructure problems there aren't easily solvable, but clean tech can help. In addition to her role with Arava's Center for Applied Environmental Diplomacy, Liana Berlin-Fischler is COO of Laguna Innovation, a company that grew out of research at the Arava Institute. They make off-grid wastewater treatment systems that convert sewage into water suitable for irrigation, powered by solar panels.
We have a system that is able to operate with very low energy consumption to the point that it can be solar powered entirely and work for these very remote communities that would otherwise lack access to traditional infrastructure.
That lack of infrastructure has created a catch-22 for Israelis' Arab Bedouin citizens. About 1/3 of Israel's 300,000 Bedouins live in unrecognized villages, despite being indigenous to southern Israel's Negev Desert, where they've lived for centuries. Fareed Mahameed says they can't get building permits if they don't have sanitation infrastructure, which he says the Israeli government has not provided.
1 in 2 is living without a sewer system. 1 in 4 is lacking access to fresh and clean, potable water, drinkable water. 1 in 10 lack access to energy. 1 in 10 lack access also to foods, to healthy food.
One of these unrecognized villages is Al Farah. where Arava and Laguna provided one of their sewage treatment systems. First, they had to build trust in the community.
They were very suspicious. They gave us like their junkyard. We cleaned the junkyard. We put the Laguna system there as a pilot. We did research there. We involved the community. Now they have a functioning wastewater plant for the past 4 years, doing what Liana just explained and using that water to irrigate.
So places like Alfora, which are hyper-arid, that suffer from droughts, you're saving money by reducing freshwater imports. You're saving money by reducing the sludge, and you're reducing carbon emissions by reducing the trucking necessary to evacuate the sludge. You have a secure access to water that is good for crop yields.
And this seems to be providing a workaround for the difficulty people had in getting building permits on their own traditional lands.
We're finally giving a solution, a way out from this conundrum that the Israeli government is having with the Bedouin community. We won't give you permits to build unless you have infrastructure for sewage. So now we're saying you don't need sewer system. You could give license. Here's the solution for us. It's been done there for the past 4 years.
We're starting with the issue of sanitation, public health, environmental degradation. These are kind of the things that scream out loud, and we're solving that problem.
For decades, the Arava Institute has worked to build trust between Palestinians and Israelis. But that trust was tested after the events of October 7th. Still, just 2 days later, they came together to support the people of Gaza.
Our partner is in Gaza. She needs our help. Of course, we're going to help. So that's how kind of this project unfolded. And we were the first public-facing Israeli-Palestinian effort in Gaza.
That's up next when Climate One continues.
Let's get back to our story about the Arava Institute for Environmental Studies and their focus on using on-the-ground projects to foster peace. I asked Fareed Mahameed how he figures out what a community needs most.
So first of all, I said trust. Trust is the most, valuable asset that you could have working with community. And why even trust? Because those communities are actually usually very skeptical and suspicious because they have been hurt many times, by saviors, I call them, who came, they say want to do projects, and then they did what they needed for their own end goal project, and they just left the community. There's a way to go to build trust with the community, and how you do it is you start to speak with the community face to face. You start to live with the community. You start to go there. And not actually, just come say, I'm doing a project or a research. So my approach is just usually go to the school, because the school is the only center there, the only center that actually is making change, is helping the community, and also you meet the next generation. And the most important thing is to make the community partners, and what I call it to do an ownership transfer. So in a lot of developed countries, you hear the same complaint that there is no genuine process to build capacity to make them independent. So from my point of view is, you're my partner. We're having a gradual process of ownership transfer. And my dream is when I'm done, I'm gone, but nobody will feel it because you're already going to hand it by yourself. I want to delegate climate rights, I call them, which means the right for hygiene, for clean water, for food, for energy, for internet to the community. I want them to manage it by themselves. So this is how I came the idea to build the first off-grid holistic integrative technology hub at a school in the world, where we put the first Laguna at a school in Israel there. So they have their wastewater treating plant there. And it was amazing seeing them after 4 years, managing by themselves. We actually providing them with hygiene. Before that was all percolating in the soil and contaminating the students and the environment. After that, they said, okay, what's next? Energy. They don't have energy. So we put solar agrivoltaic fields. So the water from the Laguna, the recycled effluent water, will go to the agrivoltaic field. We do there agricultural research and projects with the students. Then we said, okay, what's missing? They don't have potable water. So we brought WaterGen with atmospheric water technology.
WaterGen. This is a device that concentrates humidity in the air and turns it into drinking water. This actually sucks water out of the air. It's amazing.
Yeah. I call it desert dew. What's coolest than that?
Desert dew.
You're drinking it like you're feeling like in Dune,
The movie Dune.
Dune. Like it is actually like that. So, and also you have a biogas system. So where you churn actually the organic waste. And also we have like their aquaponic and hydroponic greenhouse where they produce their own food. So if you look at it all, it's like integrative in a way that all the rights are there. They can produce their own energy. They recycle their own wastewater. They use it for irrigation. They produce their own water and produce their own gas to cook and recycle their waste.
Mahameed sees these climate rights, the rights to clean water, food, and energy, as essential preconditions for peace. Back in 2019, the Arava Institute partnered with a Palestinian NGO called Damour for Community Development to bring atmospheric water generators to Gaza. The group installed 7 water gen systems in hospitals, universities, and camps in the territory. Then, on October 7, 2023, Hamas-led militants launched a surprise attack from Gaza, killing about 1,200 people and taking around 250 hostages. Israel's military response has devastated much of Gaza, causing widespread destruction and heavy civilian casualties.
It has always been important to the Arava Institute and our very, very close Palestinian NGO partner, Damour for Community Development, to always look forward, always look long-term as well. But with the catastrophe of the moment, we needed to also adapt to meeting urgent needs so that people would live to see the future that we are committed to building.
The Jumpstarting Hope in Gaza project began with the intention of creating green, sustainable refugee shelters, and it happened very quickly.
Jumpstarting Hope in Gaza unfolded, I would say, on October 9th, when we had a pre-scheduled call. We weren't sure if anyone could face one another. It was extremely painful coming to a call with that amount of emotions and shock and uncertainty, but we decided to meet anyway. And I think that even just saying this, that sets the tone for what I have learned throughout this time and the impact of trust and the ability to move into implementation mode and maintain relationships that even when it's hard, you show up because you care about each other. And so on October 9th, we had a call with our mentor, former Ambassador Dennis Ross, and had a conversation about, okay, we definitely did not know the extent of how things were going to unfold and the destruction. But we did know that what we can continue to do is to show the world that Israelis and Palestinians refuse to not work together, and we refuse to let people continue to suffer.
The Arava Institute mobilized urgent humanitarian aid, providing tents and shelters for people on the ground. When access to Gaza was cut off, Arava pivoted and started sending money through their Palestinian partner organization, Damour for Community Development. Tahani Abu Daka is a board member and volunteer with Damour. She got trapped in Gaza for 7 months following October 7th.
Tahani Abu Daka, who is one of the strongest, most amazing women I'll ever have the privilege of meeting in my life, she went, I believe, October 6th, maybe 5th, to visit her parents because she's originally from Gaza. And as a very dedicated community builder, she immediately went into action mode. And this is also how the Arava Institute came to say, our partner is in Gaza. She needs our help. Of course, this is what it demands of us. Of course, we're going to help. And we were the first public-facing Israeli-Palestinian effort in Gaza. I'm extremely proud to be part of that and to be able to say that, because to show unity in this time of division where our narratives are polar opposite and everything, including the international community, is against the resolution of that division, that we can hold this little seed of hope. Now, Jumpstarting Hope is known very well in Gaza, and it's beautiful to me. And they know that it's partnered with Israelis. Tahani does not stray away from sharing this, because again, the project, apart from saving lives and and providing urgent aid, it's representative of what a future of cooperation could be.
A shaky ceasefire is holding for now, but it's going to take years to rebuild Gaza, and the future is very uncertain. Until large-scale rebuilding is complete, meeting basic sanitation, hygiene, and energy needs remains a critical priority.
We have our dear colleagues in Gaza actually managing the camps that we are fundraising for, we're procuring aid for. So they're kind of on the implementation side of things, and we're on the technical expertise, the procurement, the logistics, and of course, everything is in communication. And I think the success is that we, even before the war, we had gotten in 7 water gen systems, which Fareed mentioned before, which takes the desert dew and turns it into potable water. So we had developed the relationship with the Israeli civil administration that is necessary to enter items into the Gaza Strip, and built trust with them, built trust with Damor, which has been a relationship for nearly a decade now. And we kind of saw that success as, this is what we're being called to do right now. We have this experience together, and we can replicate it. So Jumpstarting Hope in Gaza turned into this opportunity, an unfortunate opportunity, but I'm personally grateful for it because I think it has shown the most humanity throughout this entire war, and that's what keeps me going.
We need to emphasize, this is how you offer an alternative. For me, was very emotional as a Palestinian, because I say, wow, there is another way. We should keep the torch. And look, like, even although we are minority, I'm not like trying to, to beautify the picture, but still there's a minority that offer a applicable, realistic solution to just never-ending violent cycle. I believe in what I call the dipole peace, which means I help like a small projects, small communities, and 10 years from now, this will be the reality everywhere. And once the ground is not only ready, it's fertile, it will make the leaders to come to a realization that we should go this way.
Fareed Mahameed is Assistant Director of the Center for Transboundary Water Management at the Arava Institute. Liana Berlin-Fischler is Associate Director of the Center for Applied Environmental Diplomacy at the Arava Institute and COO of Laguna Innovation. Thank you both for joining us on Climate One.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Hey everyone, it's the end of our show, and that means it's time for Climate One More Thing. I want to start by giving a love letter to public transportation and some advice for anyone that's going to visit New York City. Yesterday, for the first time, even though I have lived in New York for a while, I rode the Staten Island Ferry. And
Ooh.
it is, have you ridden the ferry before?
I have, as a tourist.
There you go. So you know even better than I do. It is beautiful, it is free, and it is fantastic. For listeners who aren't familiar, Staten Island is a borough of New York City, and to get from there to Manhattan, you can take a free ferry that takes you across the water, gives you a beautiful view of the Statue of Liberty, and gets you to Whitehall Station at the southern tip of Manhattan. And I took it early in the morning, and it was just such a beautiful view. And I thought, man, this is a great way to help out the environment, save more than $2 that I would spend on a subway ticket. And I just really liked it. It made me feel good about what I was doing, and I felt good doing it. So thank you for making that free, even though I'm the taxpayer that makes it free, but we won't get into that. So if you come visit New York City, it's a great thing to do.
So aqua transport is great where it's possible.
Yeah, that's right. How about you, Ariana?
I can't take a ferry anywhere because I live in the desert. But for my Climate One More Thing this week, I'm excited that Time magazine has released its third iteration of their Climate 100 list. They highlight people who are continuing to work at climate at many levels, including the highest levels of government, finance, tech, and business. And there are a lot of notable names on this list. And, dust shoulder, pretty excited to see a lot of former Climate One guests on this list. Also notable figures like King Charles and Pope Leo, who are not yet Climate One guests, but you never know.
When are they going to put you on that list?
Good question, Kusha. Great question.
I'd vote for you. I don't know if it's a voting thing, but I'd vote for you. Who do I have to call?
Yeah, call Time.
Hey, Time Magazine. Come on.
And there's a bunch of people that I hope we get a chance to talk to sometime, like Josh Green, the governor of Hawaii, Christine Lagarde, president of the European Central Bank. Just a lot of really interesting and notable figures. And it gives me a real sense of optimism in this moment that there are so many people doing good work when sometimes it can feel kind of dark. So that's our show. Thank you so much for listening. If you want to find out what our team is reading, sign up for our newsletter at climateone.org.
Climate One is a production of the Commonwealth Club. Our team includes Greg Dalton, Brad Marshland, Jenny Park, Austin Colon, Megan Basilia, Ariana Brocious, and Rachel Lacey. Our theme music is by George Young. I'm Kushan Avdar.